It was a quiet night when the ship came. The stars above the vast inland plains twinkled as they always did, indifferent to the lives below. Lord Alden, a man of simple means despite his noble title, was tending to his modest farm under the pale light of a crescent moon. His lands stretched far, but they were humble, rolling fields of wheat and barley, a small orchard, and a weathered stone house that he had built with his own hands. Though he bore the title of Lord, Alden had long abandoned the trappings of wealth and power. He lived alone, save for his old dog, Bramble, and the occasional company of traveling merchants who stopped by for shelter. That night, as Alden mended a broken fence post, he saw it, a streak of light cutting across the sky, brighter than any shooting star he had ever witnessed. It burned white-hot, trailing sparks as it descended rapidly toward the horizon. Then came the sound, a low rumble that seemed to shake the earth itself. Bramble barked furiously, his hackles raised, but Alden stood frozen, watching as the light disappeared behind a distant hill. Curiosity got the better of him. Grabbing his lantern and slinging his coat over his shoulders, Alden set out toward the source of the disturbance. The walk took him nearly an hour, through fields and over rocky outcrops. When he crested the final hill, he stopped dead in his tracks. There it was, a ship unlike anything he could comprehend. Its surface gleamed like polished silver, smooth and seamless as if it had been forged by hands far beyond human skill. It rested in a shallow crater, steam hissing softly from its underside. Alden's first thought was that it might be some strange contraption from a distant kingdom, a weapon or an airship, but no kingdom he knew possessed such technology. And then he saw the child. It sat at the edge of the crater, wrapped in shimmering fabric that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The child looked human, or almost human. Its skin was pale and unblemished, its hair dark and wild like a storm cloud. But what caught Alden's eye most was its tail, long and sinuous, covered in fine fur that twitched nervously as if sensing danger. The child looked up at him with wide violet eyes that seemed impossibly old for such a young face. It made no sound but stared at him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Alden hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. "Well," he muttered to himself, "can't very well leave you here." The child didn't resist as he scooped it up into his arms. Its tail curled around his forearm instinctively, a gesture that felt oddly trusting. Bramble growled low in his throat when Alden returned home with the strange bundle, but after a few cautious sniffs, even the old dog seemed to accept their new guest. Alden named him Kael. For 10 years, Kael lived with Lord Alden on his quiet farmstead. The boy grew quickly, faster than any normal child, and by the time he was 10, he was already taller than most grown men in the nearby villages. He was strong too, unnaturally so, and Alden had to teach him how to temper his strength after several broken tools and shattered door frames. But Kael was kind-hearted and eager to learn. He helped Alden with the farm work, tended to Bramble in his old age, and listened intently to stories by firelight about knights and kings from ages past. If not for the tail that swayed behind him like an ever-present reminder of his otherness, and those piercing violet eyes, he might have passed for an ordinary boy. Yet there were moments when Alden sensed something deeper within Kael, something ancient and untamed. Sometimes he would catch Kael staring at the horizon, as if searching for something beyond the edge of sight. Other times, Kael would disappear into the woods for hours at a time, returning with no explanation but an air of quiet contemplation. Alden never pressed him about where he came from or why he was different. It wasn't in his nature to pry. He simply accepted Kael as he was, a gift from the stars or perhaps some cosmic accident, and raised him as best he could. Then came that night. It was late autumn when Kael saw the full moon for the first time. The skies had been unusually cloudy during every previous lunar cycle since his arrival on Earth, an odd coincidence that Alden had never given much thought to until now. The clouds parted just after sunset, revealing a perfect silver disk hanging low in the sky. Kael had been chopping wood near the edge of the forest when it happened. He froze mid-swing as pale moonlight bathed him in its glow. Alden watched from afar, leaning against the fence with a pipe in hand. At first, he thought nothing of it, just another beautiful night under heaven's watchful eye. But then Kael dropped the axe. The boy's body tensed unnaturally. His breathing grew ragged and shallow. His tail lashed violently behind him like an agitated serpent. And then he screamed, a sound so guttural and primal that it made Alden's blood run cold. Kael fell to his knees as something began to change within him, his muscles rippling beneath his skin like waves on a stormy sea, his violet eyes glowing brighter than ever before, his tail thrashing wildly against the ground. And above them all, the full moon shone brighter still. The transformation was unlike anything Alden had ever seen, or could have imagined in his worst nightmares. Kael's body twisted and expanded, his bones cracking audibly as they stretched and reshaped. His skin darkened, taking on a coarse, fur-like texture, and his tail grew thicker, thrashing against the ground with enough force to send tremors rippling through the earth. Within moments, the boy Alden had raised was gone, replaced by a towering beast, a giant monkey that loomed over the treetops, its shadow swallowing the farmstead whole. Alden stumbled backward, his pipe falling from his lips as he stared up at the creature in disbelief. "Kael," he shouted, though his voice was drowned out by the guttural roar that erupted from the beast's throat. The sound was deafening, shaking the very air and sending flocks of birds scattering into the night sky. The giant monkey, Kael**, was uncontrollable. His violet eyes, once so calm and curious, now blazed with a wild, feral light. He swung his massive arms with reckless abandon, smashing through trees as if they were twigs. The barn was the first to go, its wooden frames splintered into 1,000 pieces with a single swipe of Kael's hand. Bramble barked furiously from the safety of the house, but Alden knew there was no safety to be found. Not tonight. "Kael!" Alden tried again, his voice cracking with desperation. He ran toward the beast despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "It's me. It's Alden. You have to stop." But Kael didn't hear him, or if he did, it didn't matter. The beast's rage was all-consuming, its movements driven by some primal force that Alden couldn't begin to understand. With another roar, Kael turned toward the house, the home they had built together over 10 years of quiet labor, and brought his fist down upon it. The stone walls crumbled like sand beneath the weight of his blow. Alden barely managed to dive out of the way as debris rained down around him. He landed hard on the ground, coughing as dust filled his lungs. When he looked up again, he saw Bramble darting out from the wreckage, limping but alive, and felt a brief surge of relief before despair overtook him once more. Everything they had built together, the farmstead, their life, was being destroyed before his eyes. Kael moved toward the fields next, his massive feet crushing crops and leaving deep craters in the soil. The orchard followed soon after. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and tossed aside like toys. The destruction was absolute, and yet there was no malice in Kael's actions, only raw, unbridled power. Alden could only watch helplessly as the boy he had raised, the boy he had loved as a son, became a force of nature that threatened to consume everything in its path. The villagers saw the destruction from miles away. Fires lit up the horizon where Kael's rampage had begun, and distant tremors shook their homes as if an earthquake had struck. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed it was a demon sent to punish them for their sins. Others whispered of ancient gods awakening after centuries of slumber. A few brave souls mounted their horses and rode toward Alden's farm to investigate, but none returned. Back at what remained of the farmstead, Alden struggled to think of anything he could do to stop Kael, or even slow him down. The beast's roars echoed across the plains, growing louder with each passing moment, as if feeding off its own fury. And then something strange happened. For just a moment, barely longer than a heartbeat, Kael paused. His massive form stilled under the full moonlight, and his glowing violet eyes seemed to flicker with something other than rage. Recognition? Pain? Alden couldn't be sure. "Kael," he whispered hoarsely, dragging himself to his feet despite the ache in his bones. "Please come back." The giant monkey turned its gaze toward him, then, a gaze so piercing that it felt like staring into an abyss. For a fleeting second, Alden thought he saw him, the boy he had raised, the boy who had laughed at silly stories by firelight and worked tirelessly by his side in the fields. But then it was gone. Kael roared again, a sound so loud and guttural that it seemed to shake the stars themselves, and resumed his rampage. This time he moved further away from the farmstead, heading toward the distant hills where no one would be safe from his wrath. Alden stood frozen in place as Kael disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of destruction that stretched as far as the eye could see. His heart ached with equal parts grief and determination. He couldn't let this end here. Not like this. Somehow, he would find a way to bring Kael back. Alden wasn't a man of brilliance, but he was a man of practicality. As he watched the giant monkey, Kael, his boy, tear through the hills, leaving destruction in his wake, an idea began to form in his mind. It wasn't born of deep knowledge or any scientific understanding. It was simple reasoning. The tail, that strange appendage, had always seemed unnatural to him, even when Kael was just a child. It moved as if it had a will of its own, and now, in this monstrous form, it thrashed and lashed with terrifying power. Alden thought back to the stories he'd heard from old hunters in the village tavern. They spoke of wild beasts that could be subdued by severing what made them dangerous. A fang, a claw, or even a limb. Perhaps the tail was the key to Kael's transformation. Perhaps if he could cut it off, everything would return to normal. The thought terrified him. How could he harm the boy he had raised? But as the ground shook beneath him and distant trees toppled like matchsticks under Kael's fury, Alden knew there was no other choice. He returned to the ruins of his farmstead and scavenged what tools he could find. His axe had been shattered during Kael's initial rampage, but his scythe, an old but sturdy blade, had survived. He tested its edge against a fallen branch and nodded grimly when it sliced clean through. Bramble limped up beside him, whining softly as if sensing Alden's resolve. "Stay here," Alden murmured, scratching the dog behind the ears. "This isn't your fight." With the scythe slung over his shoulder, Alden set out toward the hills where Kael's roars echoed like thunder. The journey was harrowing. The closer Alden got to Kael, the more devastation he encountered. Entire swaths of forest had been flattened, and boulders lay scattered as if hurled by some vengeful god. The air smelled of crushed vegetation and raw earth. Finally, he found Kael, or rather, the beast. The giant monkey stood atop a rocky outcrop, silhouetted against the full moon. Its massive chest heaved with each breath, and its glowing violet eyes scanned the horizon as if searching for something else to destroy. Alden swallowed hard and tightened his grip on the scythe. He didn't have a plan beyond getting close enough to strike. Stealth would be his only ally. He crept through the shadows, using fallen trees and jagged rocks as cover. Each step felt like an eternity as he edged closer to the towering figure. When he was within striking distance, close enough to see the coarse fur rippling along Kael's back, he hesitated. "Kael," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The beast froze. For a fleeting moment, Alden thought he had reached him, that somewhere inside that monstrous form, Kael could still hear him. But then Kael turned sharply, his glowing eyes locking onto Alden with a feral intensity that sent ice through his veins. There was no recognition in that gaze, only rage. Kael roared and lunged toward him with terrifying speed, his massive hand swiping at Alden like a battering ram. Alden dove to the side just in time, rolling across the ground as Kael's fist slammed into the earth where he had stood moments before. "Damn it all," Alden muttered under his breath as he scrambled to his feet. There would be no reasoning with Kael, not like this. The beast charged again, but this time Alden was ready. He darted between its legs, narrowly avoiding another devastating blow. As he passed beneath Kael's towering frame, he swung the scythe with all his might at the base of the tail. The blade struck true. Kael let out an ear-splitting scream, a sound so raw and guttural that it seemed to shake the very stars above them. The tail thrashed wildly as blood sprayed across the ground in dark arcs. But it didn't sever completely. The scythe had lodged halfway through. Alden barely had time to react before Kael spun around in a frenzy, swiping at him with one massive hand. The blow caught him square in the chest and sent him flying into a nearby tree. Pain exploded through his body as he crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Through blurred vision, Alden saw Kael clutching at his wounded tail with both hands, howling in agony. The beast staggered backward, its movements erratic and uncoordinated as if disoriented by pain. Alden forced himself to stand despite the searing pain in his ribs. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. Gripping the scythe once more, he charged forward with a roar of his own, a sound born not of rage, but desperation and love for the boy who had been taken from him. He swung again and again at the tail until finally, with one last mighty strike, it came free. Kael's scream echoed across the hills as his severed tail fell to the ground with a heavy thud. The beast collapsed moments later, its massive body convulsing violently before going still. Alden stood over him, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. His scythe clattered to the ground as he fell to his knees beside Kael's motionless form. "Please," he whispered hoarsely. "Please come back." The full moon continued to shine down on them, both as silence settled over the hills. Alden knelt there, his breath ragged, his body aching from the blow he'd taken. The massive form of the beast, Kael, lay still before him, its chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The severed tail twitched faintly on the ground a few feet away, its fur matted with blood. Alden stared at it, his mind racing with questions he couldn't begin to answer. Had it worked? Was Kael still alive? And if he was, would he ever be the same? The moonlight bathed the scene in an eerie glow, casting long shadows over the destruction Kael had wrought. The hills were silent now, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Bramble's distant bark echoed faintly from far off, but Alden didn't dare move. His eyes remained fixed on Kael's massive form. Then, slowly, something began to happen. The fur covering Kael's body started to recede, melting away like frost under the morning sun. His enormous limbs shrank, the monstrous muscles fading as his frame diminished in size. The grotesque features of the giant monkey softened and shifted, becoming more human with each passing moment. Alden watched in stunned silence as the transformation reversed itself before his very eyes. Within minutes, the beast was gone. In its place lay a boy Alden recognized all too well. Kael's dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt, his pale skin marred by cuts and bruises. His chest rose and fell weakly as he lay unconscious on the ground. "Kael," Alden whispered, his voice trembling. He crawled forward on hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. When he reached Kael's side, he hesitated for only a moment before placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. The warmth of his skin was a relief, proof that he was alive. "Kael," Alden said again, louder this time. The boy stirred slightly, his violet eyes fluttering open. For a moment, they were unfocused, distant, as if he were still lost in some dream or nightmare. But then they locked onto Alden's face, and recognition dawned in their depths. "Alden." Kael's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Alden let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down his face despite himself. "You're back," he said hoarsely. "You're really back." Kael tried to sit up but winced in pain, clutching at his side. What happened?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and fear. Alden hesitated, unsure how to explain what had just transpired, or even if he should. How could he tell Kael that he had become a monster under the full moon? That he had destroyed everything they had built together? That Alden had been forced to harm him to bring him back? You lost control," Alden said carefully. "But it's over now. You're safe." Kael's eyes widened as fragments of memory seemed to return to him. I remember seeing the moon," he murmured. And then everything went dark. Alden placed a hand on Kael's shoulder again, squeezing it gently. "It wasn't your fault," he said firmly. "Whatever this is, whatever happened to you, we'll figure it out together." Kael nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. He glanced around at the devastation surrounding them, the shattered trees, the upturned earth, and his face fell further. "Did I do all this?" he asked quietly. Alden didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The truth was written plainly across his face. "I'm sorry," Kael whispered, tears welling up in his violet eyes. "Don't be," Alden said quickly. "This wasn't you." "Not really." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night stretched on around them, cold and quiet save for the distant howl of a wolf somewhere in the hills. Finally, Alden stood and helped Kael to his feet. The boy wobbled unsteadily, but managed to stay upright with Alden's support. "We need to get out of here," Alden said grimly. "The villagers will have seen or heard what happened by now. They'll come looking for answers, and I don't think they'll understand." Kael nodded silently, leaning heavily against Alden as they began their slow trek back toward what little remained of their home. By the time they reached the ruins of the farmstead, dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, casting long shadows over the wreckage. Bramble limped out from behind a pile of debris as they approached, barking softly in greeting before nuzzling against Kael's leg. The boy knelt down and hugged the old dog tightly, burying his face in its fur as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. Alden watched them for a moment before turning his gaze toward what remained of their home, or rather, what didn't remain. The barn was gone entirely. Only splintered wood and scattered tools marked where it had once stood. The house was little more than rubble now, a heap of broken stone and shattered memories. But even as despair threatened to take hold of him again, Alden felt a spark of determination ignite within him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He didn't know where they would go or how they would survive after this. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't abandon Kael. Not now, not ever. Whatever this curse or power was that lay within him, whatever secrets Kael's past held, they would face it together. And if anyone tried to harm him, well, Alden still had that scythe handy. "Come on," he said finally, placing a hand on Kael's shoulder once more. "We've got work to do." The invaders came swiftly, their ships descending through Earth's atmosphere like streaks of fire. They were sleek, black vessels, small but menacing, bristling with alien weaponry that gleamed ominously under the sun. They had come for one reason: Kael. The signal from his transformation had been like a beacon, alerting his kind across the stars. They knew what it meant. One of their own had turned into the monstrous Oozuru, the giant ape form that was both a curse and a weapon of unimaginable power. But what they found upon arrival was not what they expected. Kael was no longer the Oozuru. He was just a boy again, battered and bruised, standing beside Alden amidst the ruins of their farmstead. The invaders, tall, humanoid figures with pale skin and glowing eyes, emerged from their ships with an air of superiority. They were clad in armor that shimmered like liquid metal, and each bore weapons that hummed with energy far beyond human comprehension. Their leader stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding as it echoed across the devastated landscape. "The child belongs to us," he said in a language that somehow resonated directly in Alden's mind. "He is one of ours, and he has broken our laws." Alden stood firm, placing himself between Kael and the alien warriors. His scythe was still clutched in his hand, though he knew it was laughable against their technology. "He's not going anywhere," Alden said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "He's my boy." The alien leader tilted his head slightly, as if amused by this defiance. "Your boy," he repeated mockingly. "He is a danger to your kind, and to ours. You cannot protect him." Kael clung to Alden's side, trembling but defiant. "I don't want to go with them," he whispered. "You won't," Alden promised, tightening his grip on the scythe. The aliens didn't wait for further argument. With a gesture from their leader, they advanced as one, a precise and terrifying machine of conquest. But they underestimated humanity's resolve. Word of the aliens' arrival had spread quickly through the nearby villages. At first, there had been panic, people fleeing their homes or hiding in fear of what these extraterrestrial visitors might do. But when they learned that the invaders intended to take Kael and destroy anyone who stood in their way, something changed. Alden wasn't just a lord in name. He was respected by those who lived on his lands. The villagers saw Kael as one of their own, a strange boy with a tail, yes, but a boy who had grown up among them nonetheless. And so they came, not with advanced weapons or alien technology, but with pitchforks, hunting rifles, and an unshakable determination to defend their home. The first clash came at the edge of the farmstead. The aliens' weapons were devastating, beams of energy that vaporized anything they touched. but they were not prepared for the sheer ferocity of human resistance. The villagers fought like cornered animals, using every tool at their disposal to strike back against the invaders. One group managed to set fire to one of the alien ships using barrels of oil and torches, forcing it to crash into a nearby field in a fiery explosion. Another group ambushed an alien patrol in the woods, overwhelming them with numbers and crude but effective tactics. Alden fought alongside them, his scythe flashing as he took down one of the aliens who had strayed too close. He moved with a desperation born of love for Kael, a love that gave him strength even as exhaustion threatened to overtake him. The tide began to turn when the villagers discovered a weakness in the aliens' technology. Their ships relied on centralized power cores that could be destroyed if targeted directly. With this knowledge, they focused their efforts on disabling the remaining vessels. Kael watched from a safe distance as the battle raged on around him. He felt helpless, powerless, as people risked their lives to protect him from enemies he didn't fully understand. But then something changed. As one of the alien ships began to lift off in an attempt to retreat, Kael felt something stir deep within him, a connection to the vessel's systems that he couldn't explain. Without thinking, he raised his hand toward it and concentrated. The ship faltered midair before plummeting back to Earth in a deafening crash. Kael stared at his hand in shock as Alden rushed over to him. "What did you do?" Alden asked breathlessly. I don't know," Kael admitted. By nightfall, it was over. The last of the alien invaders lay dead or had fled back into orbit aboard their remaining ships. The villagers stood victorious, but weary amid the smoldering ruins of what had once been Alden's farmstead. As they gathered around Kael and Alden, there was no anger or fear in their eyes, only gratitude and determination. "They'll come back," one man said grimly. "Let them," Alden replied firmly. "We'll be ready." Kael looked up at him then, his violet eyes filled with both sorrow and hope, and nodded. For now, humanity had won. But this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. A battle not just for survival, but for freedom against forces far greater than themselves. And humanity would fight, not because they were stronger or more advanced, but because they refused to bow to anyone who sought to take what was theirs. They would fight because they were human, and that alone made them unstoppable.